welcome everyone to the 11th Annual Social Theory Forum at UMass Boston. My name is Leslie Wong. I am an assistant professor of sociology at UMass Boston and one of the organizers of the Social Theory Forum. Thank you so much for coming out on such a gorgeous Saturday. I know this doesn't happen almost ever in Boston, so thank you for coming. Okay, so I'm going to introduce Dr. Patricia Hill-Collins. So as we all know, she is one of the defining voices of contemporary feminist and race scholarship. She is currently a distinguished university professor of sociology at the University of Maryland, College Park, and the Charles Phelps Taft Emeritus Professor of Sociology within the Department of African American Studies at the University of Cincinnati. In 2008, she became the 100th president of the American Sociological Association, the first African American woman elected to this position in the organization's 110-year history. Well, at the time it was 104, now it's 110 years. It's 110 years old now. Yeah, I did the math this morning. Okay, yeah. So she is a prolific scholar activist, and her many award-winning books include Black Feminist Thought, Knowledge, Consciousness, and the Politics of Empowerment, Race, Class, and Gender, an anthology, Black Sexual Politics, African Americans, Gender, and the New Racism, From Black Power to Hip Hop, Essays on Racism, Nationalism, and Feminism, Fighting Words, Black Women and the Search for Justice, and the Handbook of Race and Ethnic Studies. We can also look forward to her forthcoming manuscript with Pallavi Press, co-written with Dr. Surma Bilge, which is entitled solely Intersectionality. And I think there's probably no greater evidence of her influence on the field than that title. So Dr. Collins' current research interests lie in three main sociology of knowledge projects. First, the epistemology of intersectionality, specifically analyzing how race, class, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, nation, and/or age mutually construct one another as systems of power and as theoretical constructs. Second, exploring epistemologies of emancipatory knowledges, for example, critical race theory, feminism, and nationalism. And third, examining how African American male and female youth's experiences with social issues of education, unemployment, popular culture, and political activism articulate with global phenomena. We're so fortunate to welcome Dr. Collins to UMass Boston, which is the only public university of 35 colleges and universities in the Boston area. Our student population, which largely draws from local surrounding communities, is currently 56% students of color and 60% first-generation college students. I have seen firsthand the empowerment that our students feel when they learn to use an intersectional framework to understand their own lives in relationship to broader interlocking structures of oppression. We are very privileged to have her join us for what has already been a fascinating and very productive discussion of new directions in intersectionality. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Patricia Hill-Collins.
Thank you so much. Leslie, what do I without you? Of course you're going to get the math right on that. All right. The introduction really was helpful because it tells you a lot about the projects that I'm involved in now. And I'm near the end of the intersectionality monster project. That's how I would describe it. It's something I've been working on for many years, waiting for enough things to get published, waiting for enough courses to start, waiting for enough data to be out there to think about what would be involved in mapping this particular field. And I'm happy to say that I'm on the front end, finally, of publishing a lot of this work. So if all goes well, it's just going to flow. That's what I'd like to have happen. And coming here to give this talk struck me as being a wonderful place to begin to think about intersectionality with people who probably are of like mind. Because as I involve myself in this project, which is very much an epistemological project, I've noticed some changes over time. And the expression I'd like to use is intersectionality getting gentrified? Now, as I use that term, you know it's the same thing. It kind of looks like the same neighborhood, but is it really the same neighborhood? And just as we don't know the outcomes of gentrification, sometimes gentrification is really scorched earth policy, And the people who lived there before, who were largely working class, low income, of color, immigrant populations, disappear never to be seen again, except perhaps to come back and be employed. Or gentrification potentially becomes the building of new inclusive communities that somehow can encompass diversity and really can be intersectional. So I think the challenge that intersectionality faces right now as a discourse, the epistemological challenges that I'll talk about today, speak to this particular set of issues. Now I need to do a rearranging up here. 1 second. Good. Nothing got disconnected. So how are you all doing today? Are you enjoying the conference? I can't imagine, if you are not enjoying this conference, there's something, you need to talk to yourself. Because I have been to so many conferences that have been painful to attend. The ones where you're just in your little suit or your pantyhose or whatever you're in, and you're walking around with your attaché case and you're reading everybody's name tag and you're just trying to figure out how did this happen to me, but I have to do it. I heard this horrendous story yesterday about the ASA, American Sociological Association job fair interview situation. It's like speed dating. It sounds horrible. All right, so I know that many of us when we go to conferences, we don't expect necessarily to engage ideas. At least I don't. Because a lot of them are not about ideas, they're about career development. Even though the idea is like a fig leaf covering up the body of all the career development. But let me get started here, because I really am here to talk about intersectionality, and I just love this little metaphor of gentrifying intersectionality and why I have a talk that's sharpening intersectionality's critical edge. Because I believe that initially intersectionality had quite a very powerful critical edge, and I want to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But now we have to be very careful with that edge becoming increasingly dulled, perhaps, to the point where the edge is so blunt, it doesn't cut anything at all, and it doesn't cut it at all in terms of what that it is. All right, let me see if I can make myself make sense today. This may take me a few minutes to get going today. Are we all ready to just bear with me while I kind of get focused? All right, I've got a lot going on in my head, and I'm trying to make it linear, and that's always a challenge. But anyhow, the talk today, remaining critical, intersectionality's core challenge. I'm going to look at the notion of remaining critical. What might that mean? And engage the whole idea of critical and to be critical, substantively. Now, the reason I want to do this is because have you noticed that we're in a period where we don't seem to know what kind of period we're in? What we have are prefixes that tell us what we are by either what we're not or what came before us. The whole posting of everything, post as a popular prefix, postmodern, post-structural, post-colonial, post-feminist. And in fact, the posting perhaps is everything that might have been progressive by deflecting it into the past. We're past that. So I don't really like the whole idea of defining something by something that already happened and saying, I'm not that. It doesn't tell me what I am. Now the critical is a very interesting descriptor because it shows up a lot in critical race theory, which in some ways is trying to distinguish itself from regular old race theory, which apparently was racist race theory. I don't know. You have to really begin to fill in these kinds of blanks and ask yourself, what is the term critical signifying? All right? Or critical feminism, or critical ethnic studies is something that someone wrote to me about 2 weeks ago. Critical ethnic studies, I'm thinking, well, that's an interesting thing. The fact that you have to have the descriptor attached to ethnic studies, wasn't it always critical? Wasn't it about being critical from the very beginning? And what got me going on this was a colleague of mine that said she and a friend of hers had to write a piece on social justice feminism. Because they've been talking to some young women of color who said, well, we don't want to have anything to do with feminism. Feminism has nothing to do with us. We're interested in social justice. And she said, well, I thought feminism was about social justice. So to actually have a descriptor in the period of time that we're in says that the language that we have been using is being hollowed out in some very interesting ways. And we've got to begin to think about using terms precisely as opposed to invoking ideas. And this is really at the essence of, this is at the heart of an epistemological project like mine. But then I don't want to just talk about critical. I want to move on and talk about intersectionality as a form of critical inquiry and praxis. So I want to begin to map out for you some of the ideas that I think are quite important for us to think about as we think about this particular project, particularly thinking about it theoretically. Now, some people will say, well, isn't intersectionality inherently critical? Perhaps from where they began, but not so. Just because I use the term intersectionality does not mean I'm anti-racist, anti-sexist, that I'm against homophobia, that I'm for class equality. I mean, it doesn't mean that. It just means that I can claim this term of intersectionality, and somehow the assumption is that it's somehow critical, because its roots appear to be that. So I want to get at those types of dynamics today. And I have to admit, you all are making me a little nervous. You know why? I don't know why. I need to calm down. Like I care what you really, I really care what you think. I say often, I don't really care. You know, I just like saying, yeah, it's not like whatever, all right? But I mean, I'm really worried about what you're gonna think, so let me try to be incredibly clear here as I go on. All right, so part one, remaining critical, intersectionality's core challenge. All right, let's think about what it means to be critical. Now, intersectionality, let me just say one thing that, instead of giving you a definition, because again, I'm going to say this is going to be part of the issue, what's going to be in the definition. I put a quote up here that comes from a piece by Sumi Cho, Kimberly Crenshaw, and Leslie McCall. It was published in 2013. And it's called Toward a Field of Intersectionality Studies, Theory, Applications, and Praxis. And they are realizing that we too are at a very important historical moment, period, where we've got to think about what are the parameters and the contours of intersectionality as a field. And this is what they say, and I want to pull something out of this for us to pay attention to. What makes an analysis intersectional is not its use of the term intersectionality. Everybody hear that? Okay. Nor it's being situated in a familiar genealogy. Let's keep that in mind, because I'm going to talk about that. The stories that are emerging about what makes something intersectional, all right? Nor it's drawing on lists of standard citations. Who would be the key person that's cited? Crenshaw, cite, mention. It's intersectional, all right? Instead, it's conceiving of categories, not as distinct, but as always permeated by other categories, fluid and changing, always in the process of creating and being created by dynamics of power. Very significant that dynamics of power are there. Because often people will take this first part and leave off the creating and being created by dynamics of power, and reduce things to categories as not distinct but almost permeated. And that's what often comes down the road sometimes. And it says, what makes an analysis intersectional, intersectionality emphasizes what intersectionality does rather than what intersectionality is. Let me read this again. What intersectionality does rather than what intersectionality is the beginning of the definition that we need to keep something that is dynamic and doing something. So I'm going to be focusing on the doing of intersectionality, and the doing of intersectionality that engages ideas that are critical and practices that are critical. You still with me? All right, because I think it's not enough to have an analytical sensibility. I think you can actually drive a truck through that. I think if I'm sitting in the room with Sumi Cho and Kimberly and Leslie and we say, we all have an analytical sensibility, and then we have tea and we say, yeah, but if we put 4 different people in the room, we might get a totally different analytical sensibility, depending on how they engage intersectionality and how they've arrived at that point in the paths they followed and who they are. All right, so I think it's time now to really drill down and to say, how do we keep that fluidity of it's something that is emerging, that's something that you do, as opposed to this thing that we just kind of write up and like use, all right, and consume. Still there? All righty, so let's keep going. There is a question and answer period. For these periods where you're going, what the hell did she just say? Write that down, all right? And then we'll come back to it in the question and answer period. All right, critical self-reflexivity. This is what I think we need to be thinking about. In what ways does intersectionality's analytical sensibility foster critical inquiry and practice? It can foster inquiry and praxis. There's a lot of inquiry and practice out there, but is it critical? And what do we mean by critical? So here I'm going to identify 2 two senses of the term critical that I think are significant to think about, and that I think map onto and match up with intersectionality's origins, if I can use that term for the moment. Critical as important or essential. It's critical that I get something to eat pretty soon, or I'm just going to go hit you in the head. All right? Important, something that is essential. Now notice I'm using the word essential, because this is a word that often has been maligned under this whole framework of essentialist. That's bad to be essentialist. We must be all like instructing mutually all the time. As opposed to there's certain things that are fundamental. All right, and maybe those fundamental things are the things that are critical to us because they are important to us. Now, of course, that raises the question of to whom and for what purposes. But critical as critique as well. Criticizing ideas and or social practices. So to be critical is not to be passive. It is to be actively engaged in criticizing something without, of course, being annoying. Because when I use the word criticize, you can go, no, I mean really analytically engaged in thinking through certain things. Now, if I look at the origins, or if I look at what we would consider to be some important moments in intersectionality's genealogy, if you were, I would look to the U.S. social movements. Latinas, Maxine Bacazin yesterday told us about the involvement of Chicanas in this particular way of looking at the world that we're calling intersectionality. We could lengthen that list. We could talk about indigenous folk. We could talk about native folk. We could talk about Asian Americans. We could talk about certain groups of women. We could certainly talk about African Americans. And for those groups who were attempting to empower themselves in the 50s and the 60s into the 70s into the 80s, both senses of the word critical were there. This stuff was important for life, but it was also important to have the tools of critique to criticize the social inequalities in which people found themselves. Now that wasn't just an American movement. I understand that. Here a few years ago you had a Fanon conference. All right, so I don't know if you were able to attend to it, but Frantz Fanon was really in many ways the voice of a whole generation of folk who were attempting to empower themselves in a global context. And in many ways, you wouldn't call that work intersectional, but you would certainly be able to call that work critical as being important to many people and as criticizing, as critiquing. So this intersectionality that we have inherited, in my mind, comes from the actions of heterogeneous groups of people who engage a set of problems, pretty much inequality or oppression. Can I use that word? Because I'm at UMass, a public institution. How nice it is to be able to use the term oppression. All right. Woo, my voice came back. Woo. Oh, I don't think I said that word the entire time I was ASA president. You know, I had to use euphemisms. Social inequalities. Don't hit me, you know, kind of thing. But I think if you really look at the voices that from the early days were really raised as critical voices and had that critical edge, all right, and used that critical edge in an interesting way, these types of ideas were there. But now we're in a very interesting moment, because I think this whole notion of critical as critique, I don't necessarily think there's a lot of encouragement, certainly in the academy, for discourses that criticize the academy. I mean, let's just say something we could, you know, all talk about. Because if anything, we're busily involved in producing little nuggets of knowledge, all right, that we can publish and that we can assemble and move ourselves along to the next phase of our careers. So in the academy, which many of us know has been influenced by the logic of neoliberalism, just as other institutions have, it's hard to have a critical edge unless that critical edge and that criticism is neatly packaged. And that is what intersectionality has to be careful. That are we being packaged to be almost a faux critique, almost a face of critique. The word itself gives you the illusion that a critical critique is there. And by doing that, intersectionality becomes important not to oppressed peoples, but to the academy, to have discourses of diversity, inclusion, all that other language that's getting hollowed out. And we have to be careful that intersectionality is not going down with that group, because intersectionality is an analytical arm very much of these types of movements. Now, is this making sense? Yes? Okay, good. But sometimes I don't know. I talk to myself a lot. It's not like sitting in the shower. You get in the shower and you sound so good. You just do. Your voice is just resonating off the tiles and everything. It just sounds wonderful. And then you stand in front of a person and you, and you go, oh, I don't think so. Go practice some more. Or they say, keep your day job. It's usually what they say. So I have 3 questions that I want to ask about how critical is intersectionality now. And this is a way to begin to navigate through the contemporary discourse and practices of intersectionality. I think if we ask 3 questions and engage those questions, and I'm just going to give a little bit of a taste of each of the questions through the rest of part 1 of this presentation. And the questions are, which narratives of intersectionality define the field, will define the field? We are now in a period where the narrative, if you're thinking about a field of study or the canon, is becoming hardened. All right? So we have to look at what's actually showing up as the narrative, the story. How will intersectionality tell the story of its own past? And whose story will endure? The second question, which definitions of intersectionality will prevail? Because where you draw the definitional boundaries includes some people and excludes others, you see. So which definitions of intersectionality will prevail? And third, who will decide? Who's going to make these decisions? Who do we consider to be credible in speaking for, about, on behalf of intersectionality, or in the doing of intersectionality? All right, and who do we think is less credible? And there's a lot there too that I'd like to engage. So the answers are not fixed once and for all. I don't want you to think that what I talk about today this is kind of a doom and gloom story, because I don't feel that way at all. I think if you have a sense of what you're dealing with, you have a much better way of thinking creatively about how to deal with it. Right? So anyhow, let me move on. Which narratives will define the field? Can I start off with a story? Can I tell you about my cousin Richie? I don't think I've ever told this story in public because it's an embarrassing story. When I was about 12 years old, my cousin Richie's about the same age, and I was staying with him in his, in New York. This is where they lived. And we were outside one day with a big bunch of kids, maybe 8, 9 kids, just all standing around. Yes, they were black kids. Racial segregation was alive and well in this country, just so you know. It was not some multicultural little like Disney thing, with a bunch of black kids, all right? So there we were, and somebody said to Richie, Richie, do you see that ball up in the tree? So we all looked up in the tree. There was no ball in the tree. Can I tell you this? All right, ahead of time. Richie, do you see the ball up in the tree? He said, no, I don't see the ball up in the tree. And I realized, wait a minute, this could be really good. So I said, it's right up there, because I can tell stories. I said, it's right up there. That branch, see that branch right there, that little crook in the ground, little leaf on the end? I think I'm all specific. And he's looking. I still don't see it. Somebody else is, Richie, you don't see that ball in the tree. It's right up there. You don't see it. Everybody participated in the collective developing of legitimated knowledge. That's what that was. This is how knowledge gets legitimated, all right? And I'm standing there thinking, this is totally cool. Because, let's just see what happens. And then, finally, Richie looks around and he realizes, okay, they can keep telling me this, and I'm just going to be feeling stupider, more and more stupid. This is epistemic privilege, all right? I'm going to start feeling more epistemically disadvantaged or oppressed. And finally he said, okay, I see it, it's right there. And the minute he said it, everybody laughed. So this is how power and knowledge work together in some really interesting ways, if you put the people back in, right? So when I say, which narratives will define the field, and who's going to decide, these questions all come from that sociology of knowledge perspective. Now, if you were to imagine a different group, and by the way, I did feel bad. I didn't interrupt or disrupt it, but I felt bad. So there's an ethical dimension, by the way, in the construction of knowledge, where when power is operating, sometimes people really know stuff is wrong, right? But I'll just say that. But anyhow, so that was the narrative of the ball. We constructed that story of the ball in the tree, and we legitimated it, and we got people to submit to it. And he could have just left and said, these people are crazy. I cannot spend time around crazy people who see balls in trees when they're not there. And there are a lot of people who leave school for that exact reason. Out the door. The curriculum is lying to them, and they feel like it's lying to them. So why should they stay there and pretend? when they're being lied to, all right? Just thought I'd throw that in there. I kind of like that story. Let me just tell you, you seem like a friendly crowd. I can tell this story. All right, so which narratives will define the field? So here's the emerging narrative of intersectionality. Let's look at it and see what it might actually mean. First, intersectionality's emerging stock story, canon, whatever, credits Kimberly Crenshaw with coining the term. Now notice I put coining in quotation marks, because if you look at a lot of what people are writing today in terms of some of the scholarly literature, they all use the term coining. Not all, but coining is used a lot. I think it's a very interesting term in terms of when you think about the founding of a field. So Kimberly Crenshaw is credited with coining the term in the early 1990s and naming the field. Following on, now this next one is like a very strange sentence because I needed to take out that whole last line. With, then, within, don't even know what that means myself. So just ignore that, all right. Intersectionality has a specific point of origin in the academy that underpins its linear narrative. So in other words, you start telling the story of intersectionality in 1990 with Kimberly Crenshaw. And intersectionality did not exist before then, all right? It was founded. It was colonized. It was discovered. Crenshaw was Columbus, all right? Or she came back from the native lands of far, far away carrying the gift of intersectionality, which now can be consumed because it's called something that we can all celebrate. Wow, she brought us a present. Now this clearly violates Kimberly Crenshaw's intentions, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the emerging stock story really starts with that type of point of origin, the aha. The notion this did not exist before I became aware of it. So intersectionality has a specific point of origin in the academy that the story can be built on, all right? So we gotta look at this founding moment, this point of origin, and see what story is built on that particular point of origin. I'm coming to that in a minute. And what comes out of that? Increasingly now, I see people talking about intersectionality uncritically as a feminist theory of identity. I want to come back to that in a minute too, all right? But that's the narrative in a nutshell. It started in a certain place, it had a nice smooth past, and now we're dealing with the issues of a feminist theory of identity. What does that mean? I'm going to trouble the stock story. First of all, the stock story. Kimberly Crenshaw's article, here it is, Mapping the Margins, Intersectionality, when the term is used, Identity Politics and Violence Against Women of Color, was published in the Stanford Law Review. Now, if you take a look at that article, I'm actually stunned at the cavalier use of Crenshaw's article, all right, to mention it and not read it. Because there's a fair amount of mentioning without, and I think people have obviously not read this article. What they've read are other people who have said this is the article that was the founding article. So what you get is the ball in the tree of everyone joining in by just repeating what they heard before. And if the truth is repeated often enough, it becomes the truth. Because people who are important enough have repeated it often enough. So we have to disrupt that. All right, this is like, we can do better than that, all right? But if you look at this particular article, you find that the article is about violence against women of color. Crenshaw was trying to highlight the needs of a neglected and marginalized population, but not a population that claimed that identity is I'm marginalized, all right? A group that structurally was not seen, and was arguing that if you really want to understand violence against women, we really have to look at violence against women of color. The article talks about intersectionality as linked to the law and its limits. The goal was to point to systems that we have, structures that we have, and to say race only, gender only is not sufficient if you want remedy. There was a reason for doing this kind of work, not just doing it because I'm interested in these particular intersections for my own personal reasons. There was social value. She says, identity politics is really the political base that's needed to bring this to life, you see. So identities matter, but identity politics is quite significant. Okay, you see where I'm going with that. I don't need to go anywhere. Go read it, all right? What this particular stock story does is it takes this point of origin story and reduces it to a simple moment of colonial discovery. It then manages to misread the 80s and the 90s, which were pivotal decades in intersectionality's history, when the ideas of intersectionality travel, all right, and they travel into the academy, from social movement to academic settings, and it erases social movements. They're not there, Because the story starts, the clock starts with the moment of discovery in the academy. So it is primed to be yet another academic discourse that can function as another academic discourse. You following this? Oh yeah, I want to give you the real deal from my point of view. Okay, it's my truth, but it could actually be the truth. All right. It erases historical and contemporary praxis, both inside and outside the academy. Intersectionality has no organic connection with political activism. So this sets up another interesting split between intersectionality as an academic discourse and people in the academy who are doing intersectional work in diversity initiatives, things like that. So that whole hierarchy is not disrupted by this particular story because you only focus on the point of origin and think about the scholarship. So, and then I'm just going to skip that last point because I want to come back to that in another point. All right, so that's sort of what is the narrative that's emerging? Which definitions of intersectionality will prevail? I just want to unpack this whole notion that the growing definitional consensus that intersectionality is a feminist theory of identity. Now, I'm sure there's a fair amount of work that's done that is a feminist theory of identity, and I'm not opposed to that. The problem for me is when the entire field becomes identified that way. When it becomes redefined as something that is the ownership of feminism. Now, women's studies scholars have been very, very central, being in the front of the line and bringing intersectional work into many, many institutions. That has to be acknowledged. But that's very different than folding intersectionality itself into a discourse within feminism that actually misreads the history of intersectionality itself. If you're looking at the populations who were involved in social movements, certainly women were involved, but just because black women were involved, it's not like we're going to take the women part and leave the black part behind. You could just as easily flip the script and say intersectionality emerges in the context of anti-racist struggle, as is the argument that is advanced within critical race theory. All right, so you get this really, interesting claiming of ownership and colonizing intersectionality feeling when we want to make it into feminism. Kathy Davis's much-read piece in 2008. Here's the title. And I like the article, by the way. It's the title that really drives me crazy. Intersectionality as a buzzword, a sociology of science perspective on what makes a feminist theory successful. So in other words, intersectionality is a successful feminist theory because it is unspecified and can travel as a buzzword. Now what bothered me about this piece was she defined it as a feminist theory, prematurely. All right? So anyhow, that's one thing, feminist. Now the theory part, I teach theory. You do realize that people are afraid of theory? The students come in and their little eyes are like, well, these are grown-ups. I'm not talking like little kids, I'm talking graduate students, all right? And they come in, not all graduate students, obviously. But many of the graduate students come in and I'm just so afraid of theory. I've had people confess to me like they're really afraid. And I'm thinking, oh, this is so sad. Part of what this is the theory practice binary that's a hierarchy. That somehow people think that thinking, the work of doing thinking, which is what theoretical work is super white collar work. It's kind of interesting that it's white collar work. All right. So they sort of think about this theory practice binary, which is reinforced all the time. So you've got people who do the thinking and the people who do the doing. And this is really significant for intersectionality if you really want to have a critical praxis, which is really a recursive relationship between thinking and doing, where the doing is also thinking at the same time. It's something different. So it creates space to do certain things. I mean, theory legitimates certain things and delegitimates others. Because if you're arguing in the terrain of the abstract, it's really easy to make claims because nobody's coming after you, except other theorists. And if you read some of the theory, some of it is like pretty damn hard to understand. All right, I'm sure you've noticed this. Who do you think benefits if things are written in exclusionary language?